Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcoming everybody, inshallah, to our third podcast in Taklīm. We're very, very fortunate once again today to have with us a dearly beloved mentor and Shaykh, Dr. Omar Quraishi, currently based in Dallas, Texas. We're very happy to have him today, and we've got a really important conversation inshallah, that we're going to be having today. But before I get into that, I just want to introduce our Shaykh, inshallah. Dr. Omar Quraishi is a scholar of the traditional Islamic disciplines and professional educationalist. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Microbiology and MEd in Curriculum and Instruction, Science Education, and a PhD in Cultural and Educational Policy Studies. And studied the full traditional curriculum of Islamic sciences in Syria, Saudi Arabia, and North America. His dissertation was entitled Badruddin ibn Jama'ah and the Highest Good of Islamic Education. He treats the topic of educational institutional identity in the United States. Dr. Omar Quraishi is Director of Integrated Curriculum at Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research and has previously served as the Principal and Dean of Academics in Chicago, Provost and Assistant Manager of Liberal and Islamic Studies at Zaytuna College, and Head of the Contextual Islamic Studies and Leadership Program Diploma at Cambridge Muslim College. And we're very, very honored to have Dr. Omar once again with us here today. Last time we had a wonderful conversation. Before anything else, Ahlan wa sahlan, Sayyidi. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Ahlan wa sahlan, marhaban bikum. Jazakumullah khairan. So honored to be here, Sheikh Shams. It's a pleasure last time, and it's a pleasure this time, and alhamdulillah, it's an honor to be here too, especially on such an important topic and with a qualified and inspiring individual like yourself, who's it's great to be here.
Hayakumullah, astaghfirullah. Again, so thank you once again, Dr. Omar. I mean, for those that are listening in, you'll remember our last conversation, and if you didn't, you can check that out. We had a wonderful conversation with Dr. Omar about metaphysics and reinstating metaphysics, particularly in line of education. That is one of Dr. Omar's specialities, and so we benefited hugely from that. A lot of people had great feedback. A lot of people they reached out. It was very inspiring. I think a lot of people benefited just trying to appreciate. I think a lot of people think that metaphysics is something abstract, just for sort of people in the corridors of universities, etc., as opposed to being something that's really living and that needs to be reinstated. So that was brilliant, and we're hoping to do that again today. So our topic today is essentially around Ādāb al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara, which is the etiquettes of inquiry and debate. Now, sometimes people think that that's just an argument. It's about winning, getting one over one's opponent. But actually, it's a really, really fundamental and important science. It's a meta-science, which means that it's used and utilized in all of the sciences, and it's a universal science. In fact, in the definition, they normally call it it's a kulli. It's an ilm kulli. It's a universal science that's applied to many different fields. And so Dr. Omar was kind enough to give us some time so that we can have a conversation about this. So I'm going to kick this off by asking a question regarding when we say Ādāb al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara. When we think today, we think of an argument, a debate. We do think of a shouting match, maybe, or maybe we think of an Oxford Union type of debate, which often is essentially sophistry. Okay, so I think weeding out all of the nonsense and getting to the crux of something, maybe something different. So when we as Muslims say Ādāb al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara, what really do we mean by it?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam ajma'in. That's a great question. Like many times the way we describe this science, we just say it's a debate. But then the word, our conception of debate is many things come to our mind, our minds when we think of debates. And what we're talking about here, however, is something quite different. And it may, in superficial ways, what we conceive of as debate today may, in some superficial ways, resemble al-Baḥth or al-Munāẓara. But I think once we at the end of our conversation, I think it'll be clear that they're quite different, distinct activities that are going on. So one of the things so the way I translate usually al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara is the science of dialectical inquiry and disputation. And dialectical because it has to do with the idea here is that in English the word dialectical will have this meaning of reasoning, but reasoning, a type of discursive reasoning through conversation and through dialogue, right? It also entails like a critical investigation. And in critical investigation of truth, though, right, through reasoned argument. And so this is, there's definitely principles that are involved. There's motives, right, that it also it has to be correct and once those motives and those principles are adhered to, then one can call this formally a disputation and Munazarah. And so that's how usually I translate dialectical inquiry and disputation. One could also just say it's the science of dialectical inquiry because inquiry really involves another person. That a person is not doing this alone; they're doing it with another person. There's an interlocutor that's present, and so in general, that's what we're talking about. Scholars do mention, for example, like sorry, as you mentioned, that this is something that is a universal science, meaning that all Islamic disciplines, right, and we would actually extend it to other rational disciplines too, not just Islamic. The ideal is to utilize, right, this science because it represents standards of rationality and then rules of engaging in critical inquiry, right, and searching for the truth and what's correct in accordance with those standards of rationality. And this is something that is very critical to pause and about. And just I'll make 2 points. One is we have other terms that one encounters in the Islamic sciences. So we have al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara, but we also have al-jadal, and we also have al-khilaf, right? And there is a distinction between these three sciences. So usually for al-jadal and for al-khilaf, the objective is to defeat the opponent, right, or get the opponent to concede. And so whereas in al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara, the objective is where both individuals involved are mutually searching and trying to manifest what's correct and what's true. It's not just a matter of defeating, but it's a matter of searching for what's true. And that's an important distinction here, right? So this relates to the motives of an individual. And the other difference is that in al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara, right, it has to do more with the type of premises that are expected and debated, which is that there usually involves muqaddimah yaqiniya, or premises in which there's certainty over, or premises that are presumptively known. Whereas in al-jadal and khilaf, one finds that there's the premises are of a different epistemological status. But also ilm al-khilaf, for example, is a term usually one finds associated with fiqh, with Islamic law and jurisprudence, right? These are terms and distinctions I think are helpful just to keep that in mind, that especially when one reads a lot of works in the Islamic sciences regarding this. The second point I think is critical is, if one enters university campuses nowadays, and I think this is, true of a lot of places in the West, and it may be true more and more in other parts of the globe, the idea of rationality, due to different contemporary philosophies that have developed, and they have certain aspects and to the truth and approaches to what constitutes truth. Is there even such a thing as a truth? Usually, universities are institutions of higher learning where reasoned dialogue is supposed to take place. But nowadays, one encounters a very different culture on university campuses, and people are still discussing and debating very critical issues, but the standards by which they conduct these debates and conduct these discussions and the notions of rationality are usually not adhered to. And what that leads to is more of, without these, and this is a point, without these standards of rationality and proper way of conducting these inquiries and discussions, what ends up happening is people just kind of impose their opinions on each other, right? And they start yelling at each other, and it's like whoever talks the loudest, and then kind of wins. And then unfortunate things like we're not going to talk to you anymore. All these other things result from it, and so I think it's very critical for Muslims, but just who are entering into institutions of higher education. And even, just your average human being who's in our time, who's in these spaces, this is a very important science to reintroduce, right, principles and standards of rational discussion. And this science is very helpful in that regard. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So I think we were talking off air as well, barakallah fikum, and based upon what you were talking about, that as opposed to this just being isqatul khasm, silencing one's opponent. But this is about actually coming to some natija, coming to some conclusion that you can agree on. I remember somebody asking me once that why is it that in books, any book in the Islamic science, traditional books anyway, there'd always be a sort of lengthy discussion on like opening words in the muqaddimah, for example, or the dibaja of a book. There'll be like a lot of bara'atul istihlal, and there'd be like a focus on words, etc. And without becoming technical or going into etymology, it's because words, they have a lot of meaning that they carry, and they tell you a story more than just what you're reading. And so we were talking about this word munazara as opposed to mujadala. Munazara as being, ba mufa'ala in Arabic, but it's either as two-way, like mujahada. It's like, it's a two-way street. And so, you're doing nazar and that person's doing nazar, which is the assumption is that both of you are beginning with recognizing the fact that I could be wrong, you could be wrong, we could both be wrong. And as like Imam Shafi'i famously said, I never debated anybody except that I hoped that the truth manifested on my interlocutor's tongue, because that's really important, just to appreciate that, what that means, that you're both learning together, you're studying together. And it's true. I mean, I know definitely in America, just watching videos on the internet of sort of these, Republicans, or, have like, people that will come and they'll have their debates. And it just is, everybody's just angry with each other, but you're not going to get anywhere because you're not coming with that assumption which is rooted in humility and justice, which is to say that we all just want the truth, and I'm willing to sacrifice my position if that's what it is, as opposed to saying that I'm a propagandist for my party or for whoever. So I think that's really, really important that people understand that if there's no humility to begin with, it's not munazara aslan. It's not munazara aslan. And I think that's very important. Okay, طيب. Now, so we have in any science, we have the mabadi ashara. We have these sort of foundational 10 reasons for why we do something. You touched on the mawdu' wonderfully, mashallah ta'ala. You touched on the fa'idah, although I think we could probably pull more out of that. We'll talk about the wadi' perhaps, in a moment. But just for a minute, if we could talk about the nisbah. For those that probably don't know what I'm talking about, all subjects, they talk about its subject, they talk about its benefit, its hukm shar'i, its relation to other sciences. Where does this fit in with the ulum? Where does this whether it's the arts, the alat, like nahwu, sarf, whatever, or whether it's like usul al-fiqh, or whether it's fiqh itself, or ilm al-kalam or hikmah, where does this science of Ādāb al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara, where does it fit into all of these sciences?
That's a good question. So this science in particular is classified as, there are different ways, as you know, our scholars have classified sciences from different aspects and different considerations. So if you're going to classify it as, is this a ilm naqli or ilm aqli, is this a science that's based on transmitted knowledge, or one that's based on rational sciences? This would be considered to be amongst ulum aqli, amongst the rational sciences, and so that's how its initial classification would be. And I think it goes back to the point that you're saying. When you say Munazara, you're saying that it's involving two people, and they're conducting an activity, and that activity, as you mentioned, called nadar. And nadar, as we know, it's rational reflection, right? And this is something the Qur'an calls human beings to do all the time, right, throughout the Qur'an. And we can talk about this later, inshallah. And so this is a rational science, and it's a science that deals with nadar. And so they're conducting an activity, and that activity is rational in nature. And so all the rules that are adhered to, they are rules that fall under the category and constituted to be a rational science. Now, the thing is that it's also a tool. It's also considered a min ulum al-alat, right? And so it's a science that it's not sought for the sake of itself. It's a science it's sought for other than itself, meaning that it's a science that's to be used for a particular purpose, right? So the science is intended to be used, and that's the question here. What's it to be used for? Well, it's to conduct a rational inquiry. And but one should how does it relate to other sciences? Well, as one knows, like, as you know, when you study this science, Ba'th al-Munāẓara, one is immediately, senses the importance of mantiq, of logic, right? And so, broadly speaking, the three broad areas of al-Munāẓara, when one studies it, one is studying, first of all, this idea of taqsim, of divisions. So making divisions. And are you making a division of universals to particulars, or are you making a division of whole to parts, of kull and are you making a division of kulli to juz'i, or are you making a kull to juz? And then the second part has to do with ta'rif, with definitions that one is giving. So you have a disputation over the type of division you're making. You can have a disputation over the definition that's being offered. Or you can have a disputation over the qadiyya, over the proposition, the claim that's being made. So one immediately senses right here that, okay, based off of this, there's an assumption that the person is employing logic. So logic is a science that should be studied before one studies al-Baḥth Munazara. It's critical, and because if you're disputing regarding the rules of a definition, right? Well, those rules of the definition are discussed and elaborated in mantiq and logic, and they're being assumed in this science, right? If you're talking about a proposition, a qadiyya, well, all of that is talked about in logic. That's the second half of logic, right? It's in tasawwarat, it's in conceptions, and then tasdiqat, which are judgments. So that's all talked about in logic. So one should definitely study logic to at least an intermediate stage. Then one can go ahead and then one is prepared to study the science of al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara, and then, but that's at just the level of acquiring the science. But then one has to use the science, right? And so use this tool. So once they acquire the tool, they have to now apply it. And one finds that this is applied in all different Islamic sciences, right? This is applied in usul al-fiqh. This is, one sees the usuli scholars utilize this. In fact, in most books in usul, there's a whole chapter about how to conduct disputations in the legal sciences, and this usually comes up in qiyas, for example, in the legal analogy, when one is debating about is this a valid analogy or not? Is the legal basis of the ruling? How do you determine that? There's much that goes on there, and one sees the science, very lively utilized there. But then one also sees it in fiqh, right? And so even if one wants to become a jurist and master the science of fiqh, jurisprudence, al-Baḥth Munāẓara is essential. Definitely in ilm al-kalam, one sees it utilized quite frequently. And then even in ilm al-hadith, it's utilized, right? And then tafsirs. So basically all the Islamic sciences utilize this very, maybe at a later point, and maybe explicitly it was done at a later stage in the Islamic sciences, but definitely implicitly, and in a less formalized sense. Since the beginning of the Islamic sciences, this was always kind of assumed. So, and I think that gets to the point that you're making. It's a universal science, meaning it's in the same way logic is. This is a this constitutes our methodology, so to speak. Yeah.
So somebody's listening, let's say somebody is, listening to this and they're like, well, okay, that's amazing. It's, you can't really get through a classical tafsir without, seeing some istilahat from some technical language from this subject. You're trying to study kalam and it says, هذا ممنوع, right? Okay, ممنوع of what? Of which premise is it ممنوع? Or يعارض, okay, so there's what is the mu'arada? Or naqt, they're employing all of this. So like, why is it that there are many modern institutions, scholars even, who are well aware of these subjects and have studied these subjects and they know these books that seem to be against the study, not just of Ādāb al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara, but of ilm al-mantiq as well, and generally of the ma'qulat. In their world, something like ilm al-kalam al-jadid that we never really got to in our first podcast, lil-asaf. Maybe we'd have one just on that. That'd be amazing. And you can see, and there's even, I've seen, some in India, there's a kind of an attempt at reviving sort of ilm al-kalam al-jadid a little bit. So if the utility is that great, if this is really linked to all of the ulum as a meta science, then what are we seeing that they're not seeing, or what are they seeing that we're not seeing?
That's a great question too. And here, where I guess we have to look at what's taking place in the classrooms, right? What's taking place in these institutions, these madaris, and like I said, I wouldn't say it's entirely absent. Shuyukh and madrasas that are deploying the science and teach it and utilize it very lively and very judiciously as well in their investigations and when they write and they answer questions. You can see it in certain institutions and scholars in their fatwa, in their commentaries, when they give lectures. But yeah, on the whole, it is something that either one finds it to be absent from a lot of courses of study in madrasas, or if it is taught, it's not really appreciated and taught in a manner that's a bit superficial, one could say. I've encountered where certain individuals say, well, it's just a matter of mustalahat, it's just istilahat, and that's it. And I would say, no, it's not just terminology. This is a way of thinking, right? It's a way of understanding. And if it's based on mantiq, then it's based on how we humans reason, right? And this is critical. And so it's not just a matter of terms and terminology. This is a matter of how humans reason. And reason is one of the faculties that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has gifted human beings with. It's an incredible faculty. And it is something that is, and so if we don't use it properly, right, and if we don't understand the nature of it, then yeah, we're not going to get to a proper understanding of this, and it's not going to be taught in the manner it's supposed to be taught.
Okay, so I think my takeaway from the last point that you mentioned is that sometimes it's about how something is taught. That if it's not taught with highlighting the emphasis on its importance, its utility, to be shown practically. One of the benefits that we had is that often when some of our mashayikh would teach, they would highlight what's happening here. So for example, if there is a mu'arada, they would highlight what the mu'arada is, for example. If they're showing that there's, like for example, very famously, in the Sharh al-Aqaid, التفتزاني يعني تفرد بقوله, he's alone in his position pretty much on the talazum or the lack thereof of the ayah that had there been more than one God in the heavens and the earth, la fasadata, and he considers it to be a dalil iqna'i. And there was historically a lot of debate around that and refutations of him regarding that. But that there is a debate on talazum. And we'll get to Rukun ad-Din al-Samaraqandi in a bit, but his text is all about three types of talazum. That's the whole. It's a very short text, and as you know, but it's all about talazum. Like, does this necessitate this or not? Because that's what an argument is. Does your argument necessitate your da'wah, your claim? Is your claim being substantiated by your argument? That is essentially. Now, I think for someone to deny the utility of that seems to me to be very odd. And it's a bit like somebody saying, I'm going to do Islam, I'm going to practice Islam without fiqh. I don't need fiqh and madhabs to practice Islam. It's a contradiction. That's what it seems to me, that you want to have reasoned arguments, but at the same time, you don't want to learn how to have reasoned arguments. And that seems to me, and I think that's a good point, that sometimes the subject is taught in a way that the utility gets lost. It's taught almost as a ritual. It's like ritualistically reading something. It could happen with fiqh as well. Where if the ta'alilat are not given for those masail, then sometimes it's lost. Whereas if you want to create a faqih, the faqih needs to understand how those inner workings, not just legal theory, but they have to have precedent, they have to have court rulings, they have to have the fatwa of the past, so that they can really get into the mind of the faqih. So I think that's a wonderful point, that I think it's just sometimes it is just destroyed in the process.
Yeah, your point about fiqh, for example, is very important. There's so many issues of fiqh that are talked about today, and there always have been. It's nothing new. But many of times the way these discussions and debates are taking place is that they don't, first of all, follow these rules. So they won't define the terms, and half the time they're, people may be talking about two different masail, but they just have the term in common, and they think they're talking about the same thing. And so, I was with a group of students, fiqh students, and they were looking at an issue, and they just had a list of definitions that they compiled on this issue, and because they were talking about different things, they found different definitions. They said, "Oh, there's no one definition, and we just have to leave it at that." And I said, "No, you have to go and do analysis of these definitions. You have to see, how is this person talking about for example, like what you said, is this person talking about the lazim of the issue you're talking about, or is this person actually giving, the malzum?" And so there's a lot of difference. So these are tools to help us have more sound fiqh discussions, which is really, really important in our times. And so there's so many issues that are talked about with even if you take topics like ilm al-kalam, or when people speak about kalam, or people speak about mantiq, whether they're for it or against it, but they don't first define what they mean by this term, right? So they're not conducting themselves according to the order of having a discussion on these things. So defining terms is one of the first things that we're supposed to talk about. And in fact, as you know, one of the major rules, al-Iji in his text on al-Baḥth al-Munāẓara, one of the first things that he talks about is this whole issue that where he talks about a very important methodology that's kind of lost, right? But he says, "In kunta naqilan fayutlab," right, as-sihha, and "O mudda'iyan fad-dalil." Right? This is an incredibly important principle, that if you are, you have to first see the claim that you're making, clarify the claim you're making, and is your claim, are you transmitting, something in your claim, or are you making, and so are you a naqil? And if that's the case, when there are certain rules you have to adhere to, and that's and that you have to meet the criterion of sihha. But if you're making a claim, right, which is you're a mudda'i, then you have to have dalil, and then you have to have dalil sahih, and then there are rules for this. So we're going to hold you to that, right? So even the very first step, which is, are you doing naql, are you transmitting something, or are you making an actual claim? Then there's a different set of rules that we're going to adhere to. And so that's the very first, principle that you talked about, but that's lost in so many of our discussions. And the moment you ask somebody for, well, what's your definition of, let's say, democracy, of secularism, of what's your definition of modernity? That's where usually discussion kind of stops, because they can't really supply one. And it's hard to have a conversation then if you can't really supply a definition. Yeah.
Exactly, like liberalism, for example, like libertarian values. Like as Muslims, there will be certain libertarian principles that we won't oppose. We may find some of them okay. For example, in a traditional Muslim caliphate, non-Muslims were free to practice their religions. If what you mean by a libertarian view is that other people had religious freedoms, well, in the Ottoman Empire, they had their own courts. They were able to govern their personal law, their family law, according to their own rules. And we know historically from the Mughals in particular, and others, that they were so cautious when it came to other religions that even if they found something deeply abhorrent, they debated whether they should step in and stop it, just because they
No.
didn't want to transgress those rights. I don't want to give examples,
Yeah.
but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a really good point. But again, it comes down to, do you mean Locke's conception of liberalism? Do you mean modern sort of French macho liberalism? What
Correct.
do you mean? It's a really, it's true. This is one of the reasons why, just a slight digression, but still to the point. One of the
Yeah.
reasons why I love al-Iqtisad, في الاعتقاد by al-Ghazali, is
Yeah.
one of the things that he does consistently is تحرير المراد, تحرير المراد, تحرير المراد. He's assuming istifsar. He's assuming that you want
Yeah.
clarity. He's not using that technical term, but the assumption is you want it, and so he's constantly clarifying. And like al-Jurjani, al-Jurjani writes his famous dictionary of technical terms just because he didn't want you to misunderstand what he meant when he was writing. So
Wow.
it's like he wrote like a companion to Giorgiani's books, which is that when I
Yeah.
use this word, it's like the students that had a debate. I mean, I've been teaching some philosophy and things like that, and there's a but you say that the mutakallimin say that the hukama reject jawhar, but they affirm jawhar. Yes, but they don't affirm the jawhar that you affirm in kalam.
Exactly.
For them, jawhar is madda. For them,
Yeah.
it's hayula. Yeah, for them,
Yeah.
jawhar, hayula are the same thing. But what you mean by jawhar is you mean something very different. You mean something material. And so, but again, that's one word, jawhar. But if you don't know which book you're looking in, and the ta'arif has not been achieved for that word, then you could completely misread an entire philosophy just because you misunderstood a single word. And so again, somebody could say, but isn't this common sense? Exactly, it is common sense. And
Yeah.
and this is a science that prevents the dhihn from khata
Yeah.
in mubahatha. That's all it is.
Absolutely.
So okay, so that strengthens our point, and that's a really good point. Barakallahu fikum. I would say about the hukam, I mean, the hukam shari'i on Ādāb al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara, and I know that there's some khilaf, perhaps,
Yeah.
fil mas'ala, but I mean, is there something specific that you'd like to say about the hukam shari'i, or maybe to calm some people down that may think that it's perhaps something non-Sharia compliant?
That's a good point. I mean, in general, they'll say that this is, this is a fard kifaya in terms of there should be people in the community who have a mastery over this science, right? But in terms of if you're a student of knowledge, and we want every Muslim to be using this, and or at least they don't have to be formally trained, every Muslim, but these are the principles that we should be adhering and holding ourselves to in our communities and when we live and how we live our lives. But in terms of formally being trained, it's a fard kifaya, right? And there have to be a group of people who are who fulfill the needs of the community in terms of what exactly their needs are. And but the thing is that what you mentioned here is important, that people might think that this type of this idea of rational inquiry and formal rules for it, and that is something that is not Quranic, right? And I think that's an important thing we should probably spend some time on. I usually start my class when teaching this is I usually start only with the Quran, just to let students know that this is Allah Ta'ala, when He addresses human beings. He addresses us using our intellect, our aql, and as you know, taklif itself, right? Someone being accountable, morally accountable. One of the criteria is having reason, and aql. And so for example, Allah Ta'ala, and He engages other faith communities too. So for example, using reasoned arguments. So, for example, Allah Ta'ala says, وَقَالَتِ الْيَهُودُ وَالنَّصَارَى نَحْنُ أَبْنَاءُ اللَّهِ, right? And this is the verse we all know, that the Jews are, نَحْنُ أَبْنَاءُ اللَّهِ وَأَحِبَّاؤُهُ قُلْ فَلِمَا يُعَذِّبُكُم بِذُنُوبِكُم بَلْ أَنْتُمْ بَشَرٌ مِّمَّا خُلِقَ يغفر لمن يشاء ويعذب من يشاء والله ولله ملك السماوات والأرض ما بينهما وإليه المصير. So in this verse, I usually say, what's happening in this verse? وَقَالَتِ الْيَهُودُ وَالنَّصَارَى نَحْنُ أَبْنَاءُ اللَّهِ وَأَحِبَّاؤُهُ. This is a da'wah. This is a claim, right? That Jews and Christians are both making. And Allah Ta'ala is contesting them in this claim, right? And he's saying, if that is the case, right, فَلِمَا يُعَذِّبُكُمْ بِذُنُوبِكُمْ, if you are indeed, as you claim to be, the children and the beloved of God, then why is God going to punish you for your sins? Now, the ulama talk about this, right? So this is a clear response Allah Ta'ala is giving them to their da'wah, right, to their claim that they're making. And what's interesting here is that there is one has to understand, as Ghazali mentioned, the style of the Qur'an. So the Qur'an will sometimes mention the major premise, sometimes mention the minor premise, sometimes, it'll mention the conclusion, sometimes it won't mention the conclusion. Well, here, the da'wah is mentioned, right, of the Jews and Christians, that, they're claiming a certain relationship with God. And then Allah Ta'ala responding to them was like, well, why is it that you will be punished for your sins? Meaning there's a premise that's not mentioned here, meaning those who are close to God, God will not punish them for your sins. But God is going to punish you for your sins, so therefore your claim is invalidated, So, and the tafsir scholars, when you read the tafsirs, they unpack these premises that are not mentioned here, right? So this is a clear example. This is, Allah Ta'ala is engaging the claims. So there's a claim being made, there's a response to this claim, and there's proof being given for this claim. It's just not it's just not an empty refutation. Well, I'm God, and therefore, no, Allah Ta'ala actually gave reasons for why their claim is wrong. So that's an important thing. It's inherently Quranic. I mean, I would even make the argument that even to understand the Quran, and if you don't understand the rules of reasoning, you'll miss out so much on what the Quran and the verses of the Quran are Allah Ta'ala is saying. So, for example, the word jadal, right? The word jadal in the Quran is mentioned about, from what I recall, at least 29 times. The word jadal. And you also have al-hujjah, and you also have, so many other words, like the word sultan, right, is mentioned. The word sultan is mentioned in over 33 times, right? And the word hujjah is mentioned about 27 times, right? So you have jadal, you have hujjah, you have sultan, right? And so this is important. And now when ulama studied the use of the word jadal in the Quran, right, they actually, they mention, is it mentioned in a blameworthy way or is it mentioned in a praiseworthy way? And it's mentioned in both ways, right? And it also shows most of the time it is madhmum, is mentioned in a blameworthy way, but there's 3 occasions where it's mentioned in a praiseworthy way. And this is actually, when you study the use of the Quran, the Quran's presentation of rational inquiry and rational argumentation, it's actually one of the functions of prophets, right? So in other words, one of the functions of prophets is actually to engage in claims that the people are making and to establish proof. So people are going to challenge the prophet's claim that you're not a true prophet. And why? They give proofs, and he has to respond to them. This is all based on reason. Right. And you can't just say, well, he's going to do a miracle. Well, no, they actually challenge the miracle itself. Right. And so you have to engage in reason, and prophets engaged in that. And the Quran, many scholars say that, the first who actually established, this practice of rational inquiry are the angels themselves. When Allah Ta'ala says, that He's going to create Sayyidina Adam, they say, أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاءَ وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِكَ وَنُقَدِّسُ لَكَ. And Allah then replied, إِنِّي أَعْلَمُ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, right? And so this is a rational discourse that's taking place here, right? Between angels and God, right? And they wanted to find the truth. They wanted to find out what's the wisdom behind this, right? There's the question that we have. When the Quran describes Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, right? Allah Ta'ala says, "Qalu ya Nuh." His community, it said, "Qalu ya Nuh, qad jadaltana fa'aktharta jidalana." So here, you have engaged in us in a jidal, fa'aktharta, and you've really went to lengths in this jidal, in this argument. فَأْتِنَا بِمَا تَعِدُنَا إِن كُنْتَ مِنَ الصَّادِقِينَ. Right? And then Allah Ta'ala says, وَلَا تُجَادِلُ أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ إِلَّا بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. Right? And then Allah, and for us, the paragon of rationality and rational discourse It's actually, it's not Aristotle, it's Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam in the Qur'an, where Allah Ta'ala says, وَتِلْكَ حُجَّتُنَا آتَيْنَاهَا إِبْرَاهِيمَ عَلَى قَوْمِهِ نَرْفَعُ دَرَجَاتٍ مَّن نَشَاءُ, right? And so meaning these are the proofs and the arguments that we've given to Sayyidina Ibrahim. He's actually considered to be, the paragon of, of rational argument, and then utilizing that in his engagement with this community. So you see, this is actually a function of prophets, right? To establish the argument and establish and make the case that they are true prophets and what they're saying is truly from God. And I think even in the Ash'ari school, one of the wajibat al-rusul, one of the necessary attributes of prophets, is this idea of fitana, right? This idea of intelligence. And they explain this so they can establish the hujjah, they can make an argument, right? To that. Because if a group of people came and they argued against a prophet, and then they won the argument, they defeated that prophet, then that, the hujjah is not established, So it's a very Qur'anic. If you look at the Quran presents a very. It does not diminish the rational inquiry. The aql is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah ta'ala blames those who do not use the aql, but do not use it correctly. They have to use the aql correctly. Hence, the idea of rules, the idea of a formal, some type of formal system of adhering to. And I recommend there's some ulama have talked about this, way before. So there's and they've written works on this. It's a great book by Najmuddin al-Tufi al-Hanbali. He wrote a book, al-Jadal fi al-Jadal, right? And what he's done in this work is pretty fabulous. He went through the entire Quran, surah by surah, right? And then he went and he extracted all the arguments, all the munazarat that exist in the Quran, and he did exactly what, so if there's a munazara and if the major prime premise is mentioned but the minor is not, then he will explain what the minor premise is that's not mentioned in the Quran. He'll give like a full explanation of what the arguments Allah Ta'ala has given. And so he went through the entire Quran. I really recommend. It's a really great book. And so Najmuddin Tufi did this similarly, right? Before him, Imam Ghazali in his al-Qistas al-Mustaqim, he did this as well. And where he went through the Quran to show, the various figures of the syllogism and the four forms and the various figures, and how the prophets utilized them. And again, you see Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam is pretty prominent, right, in this. And when he's arguing against Nimrod, and he's arguing against his other, his father as well. So it's a very, very Quranic science, and there's another work really nice by it's called Kitab Istikhraj al-Jadal min al-Qur'an al-Karim. Kitab Istikhraj al-Jadal min al-Qur'an al-Karim, and this is by another great, interestingly enough, Hanbali scholar, right? And he wrote another book on this, and so I highly recommend these works to see just how and all of these works are showing how the Quran, right, utilizes rational argumentation. And another side note, maybe relevant, to us in our times, the scholars who actually did, write works on jadal and munazara and this type of rational inquiry in the Quran, many of them were Hanbalis. As you know, Najmuddin Tufi is a Hanbali, this Kitab al-Istikhraj as well, the author is a Hanbali. So many of the Hanbalis actually paid attention to this, and they wrote some really useful works in this regard. Yeah, so it's a very, to conclude, it's a very, it's a very Quranic science. It's, I think, fully validated by the Quran. There's so many Quranic examples that that one can use. It's a role and function of prophets as well. Allah Ta'ala addresses us using, our aql, and gives us reasons as well that are fully rational. And so it's definitely not definitely not contrary to Sharia. In fact, it's advocated and required, I would say, Allahu Alam.
Barakallahu fikum. That's wonderful. I think 3 books there that you mentioned, Ilm al-Jadal by Tufi and Kitab al-Istikhraj, and also al-Qistas by al-Ghazali. And it's interesting, I mean, if you'd allow me, Sayyidi, now, one of the things that I loved about al-Qistas is that it's not just that he says it's a Quranic science, and that, al-Muallim al-Awwal, he says, oh, you say al-Muallim al-Awwal is Aflatun. He says, no, al-Muallim al-Awwal huwa Allah, right? And so then but what I really loved is it's the superiority complex of Al-Ghazali, uh, for the sake of Allah, of course, right?
Yeah.
Not in any kind of asabiya way, but like from the perspective of being a Muslim, is that he does not even use the terminology of traditional munafiqah. He gives them his own names, and he doesn't call them like the five hujjas that he identifies in the book. Yes, they're the hujjas that we know based upon basically the five results out of syllogism, but it's the fact that he gives everything his own name. Either it's al-Saghir, al-Awsat, al-Kabir. He's got his own way. He doesn't consider Shakl al-Rabi', it seems, right? And so, and that's fine because that's common. But my point is that he could have just said a Shakl al-Awwal. No, he could have said a Shakl al-Thani, a Shakl al-Thalith, figure 1, figure 2. No, he gave it his own, highlighting the fact that, all of this that we're talking about, that I'm showing you from al-Qur'an al-Kareem, if the words are problematic to you, then let's do away with the words. It's our subject anyway. So I think that is very unique, that rather than sitting there and thinking that this is some kind of a Greek thing, no, the Greeks may have had it, but وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. Ultimately, alluding to the verses that you were referring to, Surah Baqarah, all of this knowledge ultimately comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala anyway. So I think that was a very beautiful reframing, the Ghazalian reframe, let's call it that, right? Of jadal. And I think it's, that's something that Muslims, rather than running away from their tradition, they have to own it and realize that lots of things that we take, but we Islamicize. Those are things that we bring in and we utilize. And our ulama were fantastic at doing that. Therefore the entire ontology sections in our books that were taken from the tariq of the hukama, but they built it into that system, and I think that's really important. Okay, so that was wonderful. Thank you very much for that. And I think anyone that was otherwise doubtful would probably realize that this truly is a Quranic science, but tadween of it has happened in a particular way. Okay, that's perfect. Okay, so a little bit maybe we don't have to spend lots of time. I think I'd rather talk to you about some books and texts, maybe some of your favorites, maybe ones that you're using in your own teaching, and what you recommend, what you've liked, etc. You've already mentioned a couple, alhamdulillah. But a little bit on the history, if I can, it does seem that Ādāb al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara is a Hanafi. It's a ihsan of al-Ahnaf on the Ummah. Ādāb al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara is ihsan, it's a favor of al-Hanafiyya on the Ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, because it does seem that this was initiated, that the wadi', to finish off our mabadi now, the wadi' it does seem to be the Hanafis. Faddal, Malana, what do you think?
Yeah, mashallah. And it's something the Hanafis of our time should reclaim. I think, they should reclaim their place in it, alhamdulillah, and inshallah they will. But yeah, when they do talk about this, like when they look at the historical development of the science, I think we have to keep certain things in mind. I think you mentioned some important points. One is that, a science can exist and be utilized in perhaps in an informal way. But then an individual or individuals will come and start to formalize the science. And this is kind of what we, the phenomena known as tadween al-ilm, right? So with Imam Shafi'i radiallahu anhu, it's, people say he's the founder of usul al-fiqh. Well, I think we have to understand that, in the sense that, usul al-fiqh existed prior to him, right? And he was engaging with the greats, right? Muhammad Shaybani, right? And Imam Malik, others, and they all have usul that they adhere to. The discussions on istihsan, the discussions on amal al-Madina, the conceptions of ijma'. But what Imam Shafi did is he formalized it, right? And he was one of the initial people who formalized it. So it wasn't that he founded the science in that sense, and so yes, ilm al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara, so there are some different understandings of the history of the science. Many people have said that that this was basically existing amongst the Muslims in law, right, in fiqh. So in al-khilaf and al-jadal is how this science was utilized, and then when it kind of remained in that state and in that area until we have a figure that you mentioned, like which is Shamsuddin al-Samarqandi, which is they debate his year of death, but some say 600, some say 690. So we're talking about 7th century, regardless, right? And then what he does, right, is that he then composes a book called Risala. It's known as Risala to Ādāb al-Baḥth, and it's definitely one of the most well-known works in the science. So it's not like this is about. Well, I think we have to understand it in that light, which is what he's done is he's taken the science that existed and kind of formalized it, right? And one of the impacts of what Shamsuddin al-Samarqandi, his effort, was that in this risala is that he didn't only give examples from law, right? He ended up giving examples from different sciences. And what this shows is that now is that this is, and that's your point, which you mentioned earlier, that this is a universal science. It's not to be restricted and used for one science only. This is how we engage in all inquiry, right? And how we search for the truth and the correct answer in all of our sciences, not just one science like law. And so one of the impacts that of his efforts is that it started to get used in a formalized manner in other sciences, right? And I emphasize the formalness because, in my own reading, one does find, for example, individuals like who've written on on the history of the science. So if you look at the I think he's the second or third generation student of Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari, Ibn Furak. He wrote this work Mujarrad al-Maqalat, and it's very interesting because in this work, so this is a work in obviously Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari's work, and he's considered the Imam Ahl Sunnah and Ilm al-Kalam. Although he has some mabahith and usul as well in Mujarrad Maqalat. But in this work, I think towards the end, he mentions of a certain individual. His name is Ibn Riwandi. And they say that he died, he was around 3rd century Hijra, so 298, and he was in 10th century CE, 910. And Ibn Furak mentions in his Mujarrad Maqalat that Ibn Riwandi wrote a treatise called Adab al-Jadal, right, which is very interesting that he wrote this work, and then Ibn Furak also mentioned. So this book has a pretty interesting history, and this is all pre Shamsuddin Samarqandi. This is the reason why I'm mentioning this. And then he mentions a pretty interesting history about this book by Ibn Riwandi, and he mentions that the great Mu'tazili al-Balkhi. Right, he's a towering figure in the Mu'tazili school. Al-Ka'bi is his other name. He wrote a book he wrote a refutation of Ibn Riwandi's book Adab al-Jadal. And what's really interesting here, so you have a Mu'tazili who's writing a refutation of Ibn Riwandi's work, and Ibn Riwandi, to my knowledge, he wasn't known to be like a Sunni or anything like that. I don't recall at this point exactly what his theological background was, but it definitely wasn't Sunni. But what's interesting is Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari, right, and passing away in the year 936, right, CE, and Imam Maturidi, right, passing away in 944. They actually defend Ibn Riwandi against and respond to all of Ka'bi's arguments against Ibn Riwandi, his book Adab al-Jadal. So this book seems to play, Ibn Riwandi's book, Adab al-Jadal, seems to play a pretty positive role against Imam Abu Hasan Ash'ari and Imam Maturidi. They both defend him against al-Ka'bi's responses. Now, the details of their responses, I mean, I'm not aware if we have their, if any of their works and if Ka'bi's work survives. I'm not aware of Ibn Riwandi's work if it survives too. And even if Abu Hasan Ash'ari and Imam Maturidi's defense of Ibn Rawandi survives. So that's something that all needs to be researched further. I'm just, to my knowledge, I'm not aware of it. But what's interesting here is you have a book called Adab al-Jadal. So it's actually a book now, right, at this time period. And what's interesting also is that this book elicits a response and from, other theological schools. and then it's defended, right? This book in Adab al-Jadal by two of the towering imams of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So now the question here is that, this kind of shows the history that, okay, if there was a book, there seems to be some type of formalization of this before Shamsuddin al-Samarqandi, and at the same time, so that's one point. Another point is that this is not in the realm of law, actually. So it's not khilaf they're talking about. So this is in the realm, as you know, of usul al-din or theology. And so I think that historically there still needs to be quite a lot of research on the historical origins of this science, right? Where I stand right now is that there's no doubt that Shamsuddin al-Samarqandi, by the way, he's the same author of Saha'if al-Ilahiyya, as you know, and you were mentioning, I think too, he wrote the commentary, which is critical in the Maturidi school, right? His work, because what he does is in this work is that he spends a lot of time on an-nadhar and umur amma, right? Al-ilahiyat bima'na al-am, right? As you know, he spends a lot of time on this, and from a Maturidi, perspective. And so Shamsuddin Samarqandi is a critical figure, right, in the development of the Maturidi school. And he has a book on logic as well. Al-Qisas al-Mustaqim is similar to Ghazali's title, as you know. So he's a towering figure, and so his impact is incredible and very important to pay attention to and appreciate. But now the question here is, though, what about before him? Were there any formal attempts to formalize the science before him? It seems like there was, but I'm not able to say that with any certainty at this point. But it also seems like this narrative that the science had its origins only in fiqh, and then it got extended to other sciences. It seems like, based off of what Ibn Furuq is mentioning, the science has its origins in fiqh, but outside of fiqh as well, in theology early on too. So very, very, very important. So Shamsuddin Samarqandi's work, it's well known. It became the teaching manual, right, for a number of centuries, and it still is. And the reason why I love his work too is because he pays attention to definitions before he gets into the science. So for the student studying, it's a very useful work to know the definitions. Because as you know, this ilm al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara is very technical, right? And a lot of the terminology, that the nomenclature of the science, sometimes is counterintuitive. So if you think sa'il can mean one thing in taqsim, and sa'il could mean something else in ta'rif, and then the sa'il could turn into a mana, right? And so on, and mu'adad, so it's kind of like you have to keep track, right, of all these things. So getting the definitions is critical, and for that, Shamsuddin Samarqandi's work is very nice. And then the Rashidiyya is incredible for that as well, to provide those the definitions. And of course, you have Sheikh Zakaria al-Ansari's commentary on this. Fath al-Wahhab, he wrote a commentary on Samarqandi's work, and then people like Dasuki and others wrote their hawashi on it. So it's a very well known work. It's a work that was part of the, whenever people wanted to teach this science, this was a work that was used in that. So Shamsuddin Samarqandi plays a really critical role in this. And yes, and then the other person, Rukunuddin as well, was a great Hanafi also. And they both belong to the Maturidi school, and so they both played a very, very formative role in the development of the science.
Barakallah. Okay, that was absolutely wonderful. I think just the little curveball that you threw at the end about the khilaf, because it's true. Generally speaking, when you're looking at the history of Ādāb al-Baḥth, and alhamdulillah, there's some academic works that have been written. Generally speaking, the idea is that khilaf, the origins are khilaf fiqhi. That's where it's all happening. But that was a curveball, an intellectual curveball, that actually in the lexicographical work of the maqalat, the fact that this because it's interesting, because these are primarily, of course they were fuqaha, they were knowledgeable in fiqh, but they're primarily theologians, al-Ash'ari and Abu Mansur. So that's really interesting, and I think that's a great research area. I think that's probably a good PhD for somebody if they're interested in pursuing that. That'd be a really good thing to do. But you mentioned so much there that I wanted to just make a couple of points. That one is about Rukunuddin. That's true. Yeah. It's hard to call him the official formulator because it's not really. I mean, it's like we talked about this offline as well. That it's very primitive. It's very short. Probably by the time this podcast comes out, it's already been translated. But
Wow.
I wanted to put it. I wanted to put it on onto the Open Madrasa website. So I translated it again. But he's really just highlighting talazum, and he's essentially
Yeah.
giving you three different types. Now that is to a degree, it is a primitive form of Ādāb al-Baḥth, but it's not really giving you taxonomy. It's not giving you istilahat. It's not giving you a clear nomenclature. Whereas as you mentioned, Shamsuddin al-Samaraqandi, he's the one that brings the term mana. He's the one that brings the term naqd. He's the one that brings the term mu'arada. These were not terms as we know, unless makhtutat come out. As far as we know, he is the first one to bring these and give them names that we can now follow. Otherwise, with Rukn ad-Din, it's more inference. We've got to deduce certain things, whereas with that's more inductive. Whereas with Samarqandi, it's now deductive because he's giving you the principles. So I think that's really interesting that happens. But also, you mentioned the Saha'if, so a slight digression. But
Yeah.
after Razi, probably one of the earliest mutakallimin that introduces umur amma into kalam. I mean, like, people talk about Maturidis all the time. Maturidis, who did what? There was a lot happening in the later period. Hold on a minute, actually. We're teaching right now. We just finished the umur amma section from Ta'dil Ulum, Sharh Ta'dil Ulum by Sadr al-Shari'ah al-Mahdubi. Yeah, so that was our third level with the students that have been studying at the madrasa. So, we just finished the Umur Amma section last week, and we're going to begin the Ta'dil al-Thani. But he is constantly, I should have counted how many times, maybe I'll ask one of the students to do it, of how many times he says, Kama dhakara sahib al-Saha'if. And he refutes Sahib al-Saha'if as well. He has a difference of opinion. In fact, not just with him, but with the muhaqqiqun like a Razi and others, that Sahib al-Saha'if mentions in certain masail, he will go against them and say, no, actually, I think Sadr al-Shari'ah is obviously a brilliant thinker himself, but his Umur Amma that he has is basically a summary of the Umur Amma from the Saha'if of Samarqandi. And so Samarqandi is the Maturidi that has now introduced Umur Amma into Kalam. And he's added it on, and he's Razian. He's the Razian addition to the Maturidi school.
Yeah.
So he's really important, So he's really important. So it's fantastic that we mentioned him.
I fully agree because I think he plays a different role than Abu Mu'ayyin al-Nasafi does. I mean, Abu Mu'ayyin al-Nasafi's Tafsir al-Adillah, it's a mother text, in the school. It's in the sense that all the masail are kind of fleshed out, and debated, and it's a very thorough, presentation and a defense of the Maturidi positions there. But yes, he doesn't get into issues of Umur Amma, so it is distinct from the Saha'if in that sense, and I think the Saha'if plays a different role in the Maturidi school. Different than Abu Mu'ayyin Nasafi's work is Tafsira. Of course, the Tafsira has its own impact. He wrote the Tamheed, and then you have commentaries on the Tamheed, and then you have Abu Barakat and Nasafi's his Umda and I'timad, which follow the same structure as the Tafsira. But again,
and the Sabuni, Sabuni as well. They all it's one period, isn't it? It's one period.
Yeah, so and the impact of the Tafsira is very palpable, but at the same time, we can't ignore the Saha'if and then the commentary that he himself has, and then as you mentioned, Sadr al-Shari'ah. I mean, he's someone I just completely love. I love his works and his Ta'dil al-Ulum, but then what he does in Mantiq and Kalam is just fabulous. But then at the same time, very rich conversations, rich discussions. As you mentioned, like these are people of tahqiq, and so yes, they definitely will engage their predecessors and their contemporaries and come up with what again, utilizing Bahth and Munazara to come up with what they feel is the correct answer. They have to follow their own ijtihad in these things, right? But then you mentioned, so also, the Tanqih in his book, Sadr al-Shari'ah's book in Usul al-Fiqh so much of theology and kalam is going, and of course, as you know, the muqaddimat al-arba'a, the four premises, right? And that becomes its own work, so to speak, where that section alone gets commented on, right? And commentaries and hawashi are on that. And there's so much of metaphysics about human acts, about will, about good, about evil. Like it's so rich. Yeah, the Southern Sharia is absolute gem, and very understudied, unfortunately. But it's when you read his works, this is a formidable figure as well. So there's a lot. There's a lot there, inshallah. The Hanafi should be proud, of all that. Alhamdulillah.
Well, I mean, without making tamthil, but I normally think of Abu Mu'in as like the Baqilani for the Maturidis, and probably Shamsuddin is like Juwaini.
Oh, mashallah.
It's like the Juwaini because he takes it in a different way. It's not a clear tamthil because obviously it's the Juwaini and it's different, and he's more like Razi, but Razi plays a different role. It's just there's a change in the Maturidi school from Shamsuddin Samarqandi. Until we get new evidence, it seems as though there was a different strand. And I don't think what's interesting is that we know why because of the Majd, but it's interesting that people like Mullah Ali Qari, Ibn Humam, and these sort of great figures later on, that they don't carry that on. Because what happens after Razi is continued by the likes of Jurjani, of E.G. Dawani, Jurjani, Taftazani, and all of the great ones that come thereafter. And they're continuing Imam Razi's sort of style of kalam and adding, and Dawani are probably the most profound of them in terms of having his own strand and tariq. But whereas it seems as though this is a totally different podcast, but it seems as though like Ibn Humam and people like that are writing in Maturidi kalam, it's like they never read the Saha'if.
I see, yeah.
He's essentially summarizing Ghazali and then ends up making his own book out of it, right? The Risala Qudusiyya, and it's like, well, why would you do that with al-Ghazali? I mean, that's fine to do, but why are you not either commenting on, I don't know, Ta'adil al-Ulum, or commenting on the Saha'if, or making a summary of that, or at the very least, if you were going to do something, wouldn't you have maybe commented on Tusi or something, or like, the Tajreed, or gone down that line with everybody else? But why they didn't, it's very interesting to me. Maybe it's the fact that they were Hadith scholars from Azhar or whatever. I don't know why. And obviously, this is not a criticism, astaghfirullah. It's just an i'tiraf that didn't happen. And it's interesting why.
Absolutely, yeah. No, these are all important questions to explore. Why they made these certain choices here? What were they trying to do? Because they're not arbitrary, right? The ulama, when they made these choices, like why ibn Humam, he chose it for a reason, and that's important. Yeah. Great.
Okay, we're going to be teaching the Rashidiyya. So John Fori, rahimahullah's commentary on the Sharifiyya of Sayyid al-Sharif al-Jurjani. And that's because that's in the mashrab, and it's in the tradition, etc. And it's an excellent book, of course, right? And it's a very straightforward book in terms of the books of Munazarah in that regard. So that's what we're going to be doing. So if you could maybe talk, and you talked about this offline as well, some of your favorite books and what you like, what you're using, what you've used, why you've used it, maybe anything like that. Bismillah, it'd be lovely to hear your thoughts and to learn how you view these texts.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's for the contemporary student in the madrasa. Of course, it depends on the student's background, and it depends on the madrasas as well. But for example, like some of the work that I did, like when I taught Adab al-Baḥth in CMC, and then I taught it here. I'm teaching a column too, so the students in column. I had a couple of options. I can just kind of, start with a matan right away, right? But I realized this was quite challenging for students. As you know, it's already a very technical word, science, and some of the matun are very the way they're written, they're very tight in terms of their expressions and the words they use as well. And I always like to provide many examples, right? And to use a lot of examples to clarify. for the students. Like, so what does mana mean? So, and what does mu'arada mean? And what are different ways? So that, we can talk about it theoretically, but you need to give examples to students. And so you actually have to have them conduct munazaras, sort of disputations in class in front of people and say, okay, this is, and I usually assign somebody as the sa'il and somebody as the sahib al-da'wah, depending on what it is, and then the mu'tarid. But so those are some of the considerations we need to keep in mind, when approaching how should we teach contemporary, students of Islamic sciences, this particular science. So like one of the texts that I studied was the Walidiyah of Sajikli-Zada, which is also, as you know, a very well-known text in the Ottoman circle. And he wrote two works, right? A Taklīm, which is, as Khalid Ray have mentioned, is probably the lengthiest text in Adab, al-Baḥth, al-Munāẓara. Sajikli-Zada is a Taklīm. But then he wrote another work, al-Walidiyah. And so it's an incredible matan, and there's been numerous commentaries on this, and Sheikh al-Attar, one of the great Azharis, wrote a hashi on it too. So it's a very strong matan. But at the same time, it's quite a lot for a student to start off with that, and then al-Iji's work, which also became a very important. So alongside Samaraqandi's work, al-Iji's, when he wrote his, that also became a very important text in teaching the science. But the thing with one has to keep in mind with al-Iji's works, he's not writing for the beginning student, right? And he's really, as one of our sheikhs told us when we read, even al-ilm al-wada' or al-Baḥth al-Munāẓara, or he's all of his works are works of tahqiq. And so someone should already know the science before reading al-Iji's work, because al-Iji is going to be doing tahqiq of many masail, and he assumes that the masail are already understood by the student. So I didn't want, even though, al-Iji's work, like you're mentioning about Rashidiyya, al-Iji's work's only 10 lines, right? His work is just 10 lines. But it's packed, as you know how al-Iji writes. 10 lines of Iji, you could, you could spend hundreds of pages unpacking. So all of these things, I had to decide what the best approach is. And so what I ended up deciding was to say, let's choose a contemporary text that's grounded, that's a continuation of our tradition, and that has a lot of examples. And then once that text is studied alongside of it or right after, we can study. It's a good way to scaffold the student too. It's like an intermediate step to access the classical mutun, such as the ones that you're talking about. So in both, I chose the Risala to Ādāb al-Baḥth al-Munāẓara by Sheikh Muhammad Muhyiddin Abdul Hamid. Right, it's a fantastic work for many reasons. And but he goes through everything. He goes through the mabadi, but then he goes through taqsim, then he goes through ta'rif, and then he goes through the qadiyah. So he follows that order. But the really nice thing about his work is that he gives many examples, right? And he gives examples, and then so what we do in class is we go through the examples, and I actually have students. So I'll assign, who's the sahib al-da'wah, who's a mu'tarid. I'll assign students, and they'll read the munazara, and then they'll go through it, and then we'll analyze the munazara. He goes, okay, and then he goes through different ways how you could respond to the munazara, right? How you can respond to the da'wah. So his work, I would suggest, is a very good work to start off students with. Especially if they're not, really deep into the classical approach to the Islamic sciences. For contemporary students, this is a good book. And then, then they get used to the istilahat, and then they get used to, they get a good sense of, okay, how do you, they have a lot of practical examples. And the practical examples, my experience, the students always said, once we went through the practical examples, they're like, now I understand what was, clearly what was talked about. So that's critical, because ultimately the goal is not just to read the text as we talked about. The goal is to develop the malaka, and you only do that by practicing, right, and deploying the science. So Sheikh Muhammad Muhyiddin's work, Abdul Hamid's work, as many of his works are just fabulous, but this work he wrote is I would recommend start with that. And then what I would do is So if we read about Taklīm in his work, then we would open up the Waladiyah and read about Taklīm there. And I'll say, look, they're pretty much talking about the same thing, but there's more technical points that Sajikli Zada, his language is more technical. And I would point that out. So you can do it either concurrently, like read from his work and then read from a classical method, or you can just read the entire work and then after you're finished with Sheikh Muhammad Muhyiddin's work, you can read a classical method. So that's really important. And from there you can go on. Like, I think the Rashidiyya is very, very good, solid. And that's a staple of the Indian subcontinent tradition. Interesting enough, like Khalid Rahib mentions that most of the works that we talk about are pretty much Ottoman in nature. And he says that the Safavids and the Iranians, they actually used, the Safavids used, back to our point, they used Samaraqandi's work in their Baḥth and Munāẓara as well. So even in the Shi'i tradition, early on, that was also a work that was used. And I think now in the contemporary times, they may have written their own works too. But in the Indian tradition, the Rashidiyya is, this, as you know, it's a Jurjani wrote the work and it's a commentary, and there have been two commentaries on this. The Ādāb al-Sharifiyya, one by Abdul Baqi Siddiqui Jaunpuri, and passed away in 17th century CE, 1673. And then Abdul Rashid al-Jaunpuri, right? And so these works are very, very useful for their very, very useful for their terminologies, right, that they provide the students with, and as well. And so one can choose. One can go in that and take that approach. One can do the Ottomans, which is the Sajikli Zada's works, right, in this. But I think no matter what, one should eventually study, especially for real, committed students of knowledge, they should definitely study al-Iji's works and the commentaries on that, because he does tahqiq of a lot of the masail, right? And so reading a work in tahqiq is very, very important. And that's really kind of it. I think they don't need to go further than that. I mean, those are the books they can study with the teacher. After that, I think they got enough to read works on their own. Another work that I do find very useful is written by a Kurdish scholar, actually. His name is Dr. Muhammad Zannun Yunus al-Fathi. Did you meet him in Istanbul? He's there.
No, but I did get his book, yeah.
Yeah, so this book is really useful for a number of reasons. One is that, he gives, he's a very consummate scholar, very careful, very well referenced, and he explains things very nicely. And he's using a contemporary academic language when he's in his writing style. He's very organized. But then this work, it focuses a lot on Galembawi's work in Adab, al-Baḥth and al-Munāẓara. So Galembawi, as we know from the Ottoman tradition, he focuses on this, and he does go through a lot of examples as well. But the one thing I really appreciate, and I told the students about this as well, is that at the end of this work, he has a wonderful section in this work where he basically dedicates the whole section to, it's the first al-Fasl al-Rabi'. He says Mustalahat wa Mafahim, and it starts on page 399, and he goes through each term that one encounters in the whole science of Adab, al-Baḥth, al-Munāẓara. So you talk about Tasheeh al-Naql, al-Ta'arud, al-Ta'rif, Ta'rif Lafzi, and al-Ta'lil, al-Ta'mir. He'll go through all of these terms, and he gives a incredible definition, and he explains each term very nicely and very thoroughly. And then he references it to Galembawi's Adab al-Baḥth as well. And then he references it to Ibn Qaradaghi's Hashia on this Galembawi's work. And so this really provides the student, even if you don't read the whole book, but just this fourth section, this section on Mustalahat, on definitions, is very useful for the student to, as they're studying the science, just to keep this on the side so they can look at his definitions that he provides on this. And then, of course, he gives charts and everything. He does a whole analysis of Galembawi's text, and he gives, he diagrams everything as well. But this section on Mustalahat, I would also recommend, for students to have this so they can refer to it. And he gives it's not just a one-word definition. Each definition is about a paragraph plus long, So it's a very useful work, I think, in that regard. So I would add that on to as a secondary source for students to use and to follow on this. So that's kind of where I landed in terms of what the best approach to teaching is for our contemporary students. I definitely think they need a text that is, something like Sheikh Muhammad Muhyiddin's work, and then that kind of serves as a stepping stone to the classical works. If you just start reading, in my experience, if you just start reading the classical works right away, it's really a challenge for the modern student. I find that to be. I don't know what's been your experience on this. Yeah.
I 100% agree with you. I mean, even though we're actually starting with the Rashidiyya, but the reason for that actually is because the type of students that really this was designed for it was primarily for students that were already at the madrasa, that have been studying, or for students that have maybe been at another madrasa for full-time study, let's say, but maybe the ma'qulat were not really, we're basically there to fill gaps, really. That's the way I see it anyway, which is that we know the gaps, we're from the same, community. We understand that these are the ma'qulat have not really been. I mean, this is not a criticism. It's just a matter of fact that the ma'qulat have not really been served well, particularly where we're at, and maybe in some ways for good reason. And again, like I say, everyone has their own tasawwur of how things should be. So for that reason, although my favorite text is Abdul Hamid's. I mean, he's just a brilliant writer. Whatever he's written has just been brilliant, from grammar to whatever, right? He just is. He knows how to make things simple, and I think he that is definitely that would have been ideal, actually. And I thought about it, and I fought over it, and I discussed it. But also, what I realized is that with students, unless they're in a full-time program, and this is me being absolutely honest, in which case they are bound by your curriculum and they're going to have to move through it. When that's not the case, people feel like they're going to be shortchanged if it's not a classical text, and that's not a right way to view it, because the ilm is what's important more than the text that you're studying. The text, of course, is important, and there's a barakah there too, but it's the ilm that's important. But at the same time, people feel a little bit wary. When you say it's something modern, it feels like sometimes people feel like they haven't achieved, and it's a wrong tasawwur. I granted, but that is just the way I think a lot of people think. And so, I think for them, they're like, I'll put in the extra work. Just I want to read a classical manual. I want to read something from the Turath, what's considered to be. Even though I consider Abdul Hamid to be from Turath, absolutely. I consider that to be from Turath. So actually, the way if you look at the landing page on the website, where I've sort of broken down every lesson and generally what's going to be covered, although that's broken down from the Rashidiyya, a lot of the examples and supplementary discussion is going to come from Abdul Hamid.
Exactly.
Because he's given a lot. I mean, I did a short video a couple of days ago just on why it's important. And all of the examples were modern, like on, I don't know, I was giving naqt, where, it's sort of mu'arada. I'm just telling you that your argument falls back on you. And so I gave the example of somebody says, you can't believe what you read online, but they're saying this online. Well, the naqt is what? That, well, I can't trust what you're saying, or, what's the difference between, let's say mana plus sanad. So I give some taqwiyah to my mana, and someone says you should hire Zaid because Zaid's a graduate of X institute, and graduates of said institute are very good. And I say, I don't agree. Mana plus the sanad, we've had graduates from such institute before, and they're not been very good. Now, how is that? Is that not a mu'arada? No, because I'm not talking about Zaid. I'm not saying that Zaid is wrong. I'm not countering that. What I'm doing is I'm strengthening my mana by saying your reasoning is not right. And so I'm objecting to your reasoning. I'm not actually giving a mu'arada to counter why Zaid. So that's a little subtlety, but the example was important. So I think the challenge is going to be with teaching the Rashidiyya is going to be to make sure that you can incorporate examples that are still everyday usage. And so the text may be classical, but as long as it can be made relevant, I think it will keep its relevancy. But would it have been a lot easier for me as a teacher to have taught Abdul Hamid? Absolutely, because it's all done for you. The work is all done for you. He's broken it down. His definitions. He doesn't let anything go. He has a muqaddimah to a muqaddimah sometimes, and he doesn't let anything go. It's a wonderful text. So I think probably that would be a secondary reading, like you've suggested. So I think I've noted that down from you actually. That I'm going to make sure that that's incorporated. That they will be doing that as a secondary source, and I'm also going to suggest the larger work by Dr. Zannun Fathi. That text, because that text I bought many years ago actually in Turkey, and so I know exactly what you're talking. It's an encyclopedic work when it comes really to the thing. So these would be more secondary sources, but the matan would have to be. I mean, I didn't even think about the Sharifiyya, but the problem with just the Sharifiyya is that it's too small. It requires a little bit more, and so I think for that reason we went down that route. But inshallah, hopefully, with your du'as, it will go well for them, inshallah ta'ala, and they'll benefit.
Really good. What I try to do is also, just I mean, it's good to ask the students, because alhamdulillah, they're studying other sciences, so to bring in discussions, like to show its practical implications in other sciences. So show like every book of fiqh, kitab tahara, kitab salah, kitab nikah, it'll do lughawi definition and then the mantiqi one. As you know, like it'll give a lexical definition and they'll give a technical one. So like nikah, it'll give a definition of nikah and then it'll give a istilahi one. Show, look, this is all happening here, right? This is how our scholars, like this is kind of the mechanics and how they conducted their scholarly discourse. So you need to really understand what's going on. So example, like if you're reading in a book in usul, and and they'll say mamnu'. Well, mamnu' is a technical word, right? It means something. It's a style of argumentation. And then if they say, well, هذا, and they'll say, هذا يعارض كذا. Well, he's using ma'arada. Well, it's a style of argumentation. And if they don't know the difference between that, they're going to miss out on they're not going to fully understand, right, the text that they're reading and the nature. And whether that's in fiqh, whether that's in usul, whether that's even in nahu, like you can't really understand Mullah Jami', right, without, this, he deploys it so much, right? So that's key, I think, in there. It's very, very important, yeah.
My teacher, Mullah Yavuz, he's a Turkish scholar, who we were fortunate to meet Mullah Jami with. Wonderful. And I remember him saying to me, قال شيخي, and he used to teach in Arabic. He's a Turk. And he said, قال شيخي كل علم في ملا جامي إلا النحو. And so for those that don't speak Arabic, there's every science in Mullah Jami's commentary on Ibn Hajib's Kafiya except for Nahu, and it's a grammar book, so because he uses so much. And I remember we had been reading for about 9 months, and we were still in Marfu'at, and I remember I said to him, I said, Sayyidi, lan nukmil hadha al-kitab, and he was like, yeah, ma akmalt. And he goes, I never completed it. He said, no one completes it. And he said, because all of the qawaid of Nahu were memorized up until this point. He says, Mullah Jami used to teach you how to read a book, wow. And it's just the pedagogy is completely different in these sort of tadrisi seminaries. But in any case, okay, that's absolutely wonderful. I think that's given an excellent tasawwur. Just to recap, I mean, we've talked about the mabadi ashar of this subject. We've talked about its role, its importance. We've talked about its history. We've talked about its motives. We've talked about text. We've talked about it being Qur'anic. We've covered a lot, actually. I love the curveball at the end, that it wasn't a khilaf, because that is a dominant position in academia, that really this all begins with the khilaf. But that was wonderful about Ibn Fur. Also, and we talked about your favorite books. I think those are some of the mu'tamad books in the field. I think the Rashidiyya is also wonderful, because although he's not necessarily giving you modern examples, he gives a lot of Aqidah and fiqh examples. He gives a lot of fiqh examples, like, as you say, all of this, even a student studying usul al-fiqh, like faqra'u ma tayassara min al-Qur'an. طيب. There's a khilaf between the Hanafis and the Shafi'is on this mas'ala. But that comes down to your conception of the ma, not just whether it's am, And is am qat'i or is it dhanni?
Exactly.
Is it mubham, requiring tafsir? Like this one letter, this harf, yani it's not even it's a harf, right? This harf has become very, very important now in terms of now you're going to need tahrir al-murad, you're going to have istifsar here, you're going to have someone that says, man, I don't accept that. The conclusion is this. All of that's gonna come just because of a simple word, and that was wonderful. And I think you're mentioning about Sheikh Abdul Hamid. I think that was very, very important as well. The last thing I think, just perhaps to conclude with, is that I think you covered a lot of it. I was going to talk about it in terms of da'wah today. That, well, let's say somebody says, okay, I'm a graduate. You're a graduate, or let's say Zayd and Bakr. Zayd's like, you're a graduate, I'm a graduate. We've both studied the science. You can take me, it's musallam, bayni wa baynakum, right? But I want to give da'wah to, I don't know, a Christian. I want to give da'wah to a family member. Or let's say da'wah, I want to, encourage them to do good. Or I want to give da'wah to non-Muslims. These qawa'id are not musallama. Okay, they're common sense, some of them, but we know that it's everything about how to win an argument, how to influence people. That's the nature of, the genre today of argumentation. So how is this going to help me in my da'wah work? How is this going to help me when I'm arguing with somebody? Will it help me? Will it not help me? What would be your thoughts on that to take us out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing that I think any person has to keep in mind is that whenever they're talking in a dialogue with someone else, between you and that person, in order for there to be a fruitful dialogue, you have to have at least one premise that's common between you and that person. If there's not, and you have to arrive at that common presence, say, okay, we both, we don't agree on this, we don't agree on this. Okay, you keep on, unpacking, through your dialogue, what is it that you don't agree with? But then you have to arrive at least one premise, whatever that premise is, that can be the starting point of your inquiry, of your dialogue. So even, with whether it's between a Muslim and a Christian, a Muslim and an atheist, a Muslim and a Jew, Muslim and a Hindu, like whoever it is, if it's between someone who advocates democracy, someone who advocates capitalism, socialism, communism, whatever, Arab nationalism, Hindu nationalism, whatever, it is. Whenever you're talking with anybody, you have to identify at least one premise that you have in common, and from that premise, you can have a dialogue. If you don't have anything in common, then it's kind of hard to talk to people then, right? So this is useful in identifying what that one premise is. And now the premise can be something that's, it can be yaqini. If it's yaqini or daruri, that's great. If it's self-evident, the premise, and you don't need to prove it, then that's great. But most of the time, it's going to be either something that's musallam, right? It's a premise that's, okay, you and the person will concede that premise and you'll agree upon it. Or it can be something that's mashhur, right? A premise that's just well known that we agree upon. And this applies to all other issues. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about, the tariffs. So we're talking about, the Iran war that's going on with, the United States and Israel and Iran, and all of these things. You have to arrive at something that's you at least hold in common. And arriving at that point and acknowledging, okay, we can at least start here, and then now we can talk about our differences in light of what we agree upon. Now, we agree upon one thing at least, so now we can now talk about our differences. So I think it's very helpful for having just having, calm, rational, conversations with people, right? It's very important because without that, then you just kind of what you're left with is that you're just stating your opinion. And you're imposing that on somebody else, and they're just stating their opinion, and they're imposing that on you. And it's like, who can impose the hardest, or who can impose the loudest? That really what ends up happening. And so that's very, very important for us to keep in mind. It's very useful in that regard. And once you identify what you have in common, then you're able to have a conversation, and then you can also then even though you may not invoke, and it doesn't have to be done technically. You don't have to say, well, I'm this is a man out here, I'm doing mu'adala. Those terminologies aside, and because it's supposed to be an articulation of what human beings do rationally, or what human beings do naturally. right? And so, I think even if we study the science, we have to leave those formal terms and formalities aside, and then engage in the, use the science in what it's meant for. This is the idea of a malaka, right? That you have to have acquire the malaka, and then you're able to use this, and the terms don't really matter. And that's why someone like Imam Ghazali, like, he keeps on emphasizing that man talaba al-ma'ani min al-alfaz, right? Yeah, we do not try to understand what somebody's saying through words. We have to say, okay, put the words aside and tell me what is it that that you have in mind with democracy. What is it? Let's put democracy aside. The words are a means to convey meaning, but the words can also, you have to first understand, what the meaning is the word is being used for. So let's talk about the meaning. Let's put the word aside for now. And once we get that going, then we can talk about, okay, this is how I'm using the word. All of this is application of Baḥth and Munazara, but we don't, it's not necessary to impose the term, on this. So I think that's really important. And the other thing is like, this idea of what's called critical, thinking or critical reading or critique. And this is something, if you allow me just to kind of end on this too, which is I'll spend a bit of time on this because this idea of critique. We hear this so much, right? It's used in the academy. It's used. Muslims use the word too. We have to critique this. We have to critique that. We've heard it. We have to critique Ghazali. We have to critique Razi. We have to critique our tradition. We have to, it's being used so much, and I think there's a lot of confusion about this term and what do we mean here, and it's usually presented as if people who adhere to a madhab, or whether it's in theology, whether it's in law, whether it's in, that they're somehow not critical thinkers, and they're somehow not rational. And I think this is representing. I think they're accepting some premises of perhaps Orientalist or Enlightenment notions of rationality, and then. And especially the Orientalist understanding where Islamic education is just rote memory, and it's just it's uncritical acceptance of opinions, and this idea of taklīd, and it's not rational. So this idea of tradition, which is irrational, and modernity and enlightenment, which is rational, and so that's being imposed even by Muslims in the academy, and when we talk about reform. This idea is always being brought up as well. And I think and I think once as we study today, I mean, all of our conversations on rationality, and we're showing how it's ironic, right? And we're showing how is grounded in the Qur'an, and these are, and how we have to be open to debate, and as you're mentioning, openness, dialogue, and listening to others and seeking clarification of their terms and identifying to tahrir al-murad. Where is it that we actually, what is it I mean by this term? And tahrir mahall al-niza. Where is it that we actually disagree? All of this is very rational, and it's kind of, I think it disrupts that, tradition, irrational, enlightenment, modernity, rational. It really disrupts that conception of us. And so, but we use the term, critique and critical, being critical in certain ways. And I want to bring this out, like one, many of our scholars, they do mention that the student should develop this idea of tahqiq, right? This approach of tahqiq, and this idea of Ādāb al-Mutala', right? These are two terms and two approaches to knowledge that require Ādāb al-Baḥth and Munāẓara. They require methodology. And that methodology, historically, there's a relationship between tahqiq and someone being a muhaqqiq, like people like Ibn Humam, Sheikh Zikr Ansari, Razi, Sadr al-Shari'ah, all these individuals, they're muhaqqiqun, but the method they used was that of Ādāb al-Baḥth and Munāẓara. And so when our ulama talk about, this idea that students should develop what's called, they should do a takwīn aqliyatun naqd, right? Aqliyatun naqd, this mindset of critique, we have to be very clear what they mean by critique. Critique, first of all, it requires a method, and that method they had in mind was Ādāb al-Baḥth and Munāẓara. So that's very important when we're talking about naqd and tahqiq. There's a methodology that was associated with this. And normally, though, like in our times, many Muslims, right, when they use the word, especially from the West, when they use the word critique, they don't have this. They don't have this in mind. What they mean by critique usually either might be influenced. They're coming from a Kantian understanding of critique, Where for Kant, critique is basically like, it's a very, he's a madhab, and he's, I don't want to be unfair to him, but for our purposes of our conversation, a Kantian notion of critique could be like, where you use reason, but you use reason to examine its own powers, the limits of reason, and what he calls, conditions of validity, right? And so, he's asking questions, what can reason know? What are the conditions of experience, and things like this. But then that's a Kantian understanding of critique. And then you have a Marxian understanding of critique, right? Where it becomes this idea of historical, material, ideological. Now, so critique in a Marxist sense, it means like uncovering hidden structures of domination embedded within society, economics, and consciousness, right? Things like this. So that's what critique and being critical and having a critical mind means, right? Of course, the Frankfurt School develops this further, and they become highly suspicious of any claims of neutrality, but the goal is it becomes more political and emancipatory, right? Critique. But then you have also genealogical notions of critique, which is building off of Nietzsche, and then you have Foucault and Derrida, where critique now, for Foucault, investigates how this idea of regimes of truth and systems of power, how they produce subjects and forms of knowledge, and Derrida, this idea of deconstruction of conceptual binaries and things like this. So critique means a whole host of other things, right? And I think this is important for us to keep in mind when we say critical, and we should have a critical mind, and we're performing this idea of aqliyatun naqd. What our scholars have in mind is utilizing Ādāb, al-Baḥth, and al-Munāẓara, right? And what they're talking about is critically assessing arguments. So it's based off of a very clear notion of rationality and logic, and it's a very clear methodology, and it's used not for critique in any of this, in a Marxist sense, or in a Foucaultian sense, or a Derridian sense, but it's used to assess truth, right? And it's used to assess the strengths of an argument, and it's not. And so, I think this is important because many people, even Muslims today, who are involved in Islamic education, they'll try to bring in, this idea of critique, and we have to develop critical minds. But unfortunately, because they're not familiar with the science of Adab, al-Baḥth, al-Munāẓara, or logic, what they're usually bringing in are Marxist notions or Foucaultian notions of critique, and that's replacing, I think, the Qur'anic notion of critique. And I think we have to be careful here. And hence, I think it's very important, like the work that you're doing, and of reviving, and the efforts that you're to this science, and how this is what we mean by critique, but it's based on principles, it's based on methodology, and the purposes of it are entirely different. The purpose is, as they said, idhār as-sawāb, right? It's not for unmasking, dominations or power structures, or any universalist claims, and things like this. It's for rather, it's not being used for ideological or political purposes. It's being used for the purpose of seeking truth and what's correct, So I'll end with that, inshallah. Yeah.
Absolutely wonderful. I think that's that's lovely. I mean, that's beautiful. I think I'm so glad that you went into that idea of critical thinking, because sometimes people probably won't think of this. I mean, it's of al-Baḥth wal-Munāẓara, right? So it's not just the Munāẓara bit; it's al-Baḥth as well. It's you, it's you and an idea, and so the fact that you and ideas can go through all of these different schools, like you mentioned, Kant, Marx, and obviously our world is run by a type of cultural Marxism, and so I think it's maybe this is a part two to that first podcast, because about reinstating the metaphysics, then how do you do that? There must be a methodological way. I mean, there are going to be certain metaphysical assumptions that each of these schools make. We're going to make one of dalala, that loves and the ma'na have a very real dalala. There's a significant or a signification that is very, very real. That relationship between the word and the meaning is real. So it's not going to be idealistic. It's not good. It's going to be realism. So I think that's so important to the methodology. And again, I think this is important in terms of what you mentioned earlier about one of the reasons why maybe people are not so keen on the subject is because maybe it wasn't taught in this way. It wasn't brought to them as aqliyatun naqd. It wasn't brought to
Yeah.
them from the perspective of, this is really about your own view of, life, of ideas, of all of that. And I think that's wonderful. So that was an excellent. I think that was exactly, I think, how we would have liked to have ended that, inshallah ta'ala. So I'm gonna thank you from the deepest places of my heart for giving me a lot of time, for inshallah giving the students and people that will watch this inshallah ta'ala the time. I think that was immensely fruitful. I think it's given me a lot of food for thought. I've written down so many things, and it's probably helped me in trying to, I think it's changed some of my perspectives actually on maybe how to take forward the students with this. So that's been absolutely remarkable. I really appreciate that from you. Barakallah fikum. And Sayyidi, I think before we go, I'm gonna ask Sheikh Omar Qureshi to end with a dua for us. So as he ends, we'll end on his prayer. So I'm going to thank everybody that's watched this, and I ask for all of them to pray for Dr. Omar Qureshi and his family, and may Allah Ta'ala protect them and increase him in goodness, and may Allah Ta'ala allow him to continue doing what he's doing and benefiting all of us, inshallah Ta'ala. Long may that continue. Allahumma ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Sayyidi, if you would kindly make a dua for us, inshallah.
Allah give you tawfiq and taysir, and it's been an honor to be in your. I know we met in person in Kuala Lumpur, but even now to continue our relationship, and I'm always very appreciative of the work that you're doing and the maturity that you bring to your work. And mashallah, it's critical, and and so may Allah give you tawfiq and taysir, and really graduating students who are hopefully, as a teacher, we're always taught that we want students to be better than we are, and so hopefully, and it seems like you're coming with that same approach. So Allah give you tawfiq and taysir and qabul and all of your works.
Ameen.
اللهم
Okay,
وفقنا لما
barakallah.
تحب وترضى واجعلنا اللهم وفقنا لما تحب وترضى واجعلنا من عبيدك سعداء، ومتنا على كلمة الهدى، وعلمنا ما ينفعنا، ووفقنا للعمل بما علمتنا به، واجعل ما نحن فيه خالصا مخلصا لوجهك الكريم يا رب العالمين. اللهم وفق الأخ الأستاذ الفاضل الشيخ شمس تلميذ في أعماله لخدمة هذه الدين ولخدمة أمة سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. اللهم وفقه وارض عنه وتقبل منه يا رب العالمين. اللهم تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم، وتوب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم. وصلى الله على حبيبنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين.